If you walk into the Louvre today, um, past the bulletproof glass protecting the Mona Lisa, past those endless corridors of, those stoic, perfectly proportioned royal portraits.
Right, the really grand classical stuff.
Exactly. You walk past all that, and eventually you turn a corner into one of those cavernous galleries, and you hit a wall of rotting flesh.
You really do. It's a jarring shift.
I am not exaggerating at all. There's a canvas so massive, it's like 16 feet tall and 23 feet wide, that it physically forces you to stop walking.
Yeah, it completely dominates the room.
It does, and it's this ocean of dark, threatening sea, and right in the center is a crude, splintered wooden raft. And piled on this raft is this, pyramid of pale, twisting, desperate bodies.
The visual impact is it's overwhelming.
Completely. The figures at the bottom look completely lifeless, hanging halfway into the water, and the ones at the top are straining and reaching out toward this tiny, almost imperceptible smudge of a ship on the horizon.
And the sheer scale of it means those dying figures are painted at life size. Yeah, and in some places, even larger than life. When you stand in front of it, you aren't just looking at a historical scene through a window,
Right.
The composition is actually designed so that the bottom edge of the raft practically spills out into the gallery. It feels like you're standing on the submerged timbers with them.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like you're physically part of it.
Exactly. The physical impact of those dark, bruised colors and the stark contrast of the pale, decaying skin against the storm clouds, it's undeniably beautiful, but in a really terrifying, sublime way that makes you incredibly uncomfortable.
And that discomfort is entirely intentional. Even if you don't know the official title of this painting, you've probably seen the image, parodied or referenced in pop culture.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
It's called the Raft of the Méduse. But here's the darkest secret in the Louvre. The thing that most of those millions of tourists drifting past it simply don't realize.
Most people assume it's just a myth.
Right. They look at it and assume it's some grand myth out of Homer or a biblical flood scene. It's not. This isn't an allegory. Every single twisted, desperate body on that canvas was a real person.
It is a 100% true story.
That raft actually existed. And the 13 days depicted on that canvas were among the most horrifying days any human beings have ever endured.
And that reality is the crux of why this painting completely changed art history. The shipwreck of the French frigate Méduse was a catastrophic disaster.
And a disaster that the government tried to hide, right?
Oh, they systematically tried to erase it from the public record. The entire chain of events leading up to that raft was a massive political liability.
Because it exposed them.
Exactly. It was a scandal that pointed a direct bloody finger at the corruption, the cronyism, and the sheer incompetence of a newly restored regime.
From a historical standpoint, this disaster was supposed to be completely buried by an embarrassed and, frankly, highly defensive political establishment.
They wanted it gone, wiped from memory.
But obviously, they failed. And that is our mission for this deep dive. We're taking a stack of primary sources, the actual memoirs of the survivors, historical naval records, deep art history analysis, to unpack the mechanics of one of the most horrific survival stories in human history.
We're going to look at the anatomy of a massive political cover-up.
Yeah, and how one furious, obsessive 27-year-old artist used his canvas to bolt the truth to the wall of culture forever.
Ultimately, we're exploring the tension between memory and power. The state usually gets to decide what becomes the official record, right?
Right. They write the history books.
They write the after-action reports, they convene the court-martials, they dictate the narrative. But we're going to look at how a single piece of art bypassed that entire bureaucratic machine.
They completely underestimated him.
They did. The regime had all the legal and military authority in the world, but they didn't anticipate a painter who decided to treat a canvas like a literal forensic crime scene.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why that painting was such a threat and to understand the nightmare that happened out on the water, we really have to start with the people who put those men on the raft in the first place.
We have to roll the clock back to the year 1816.
Set the scene for us. What is the geopolitical reality of France at this exact moment?
It's basically a powder keg of resentment and political instability.
Okay.
So it's 1816. And the Bourbon monarchy has just been freshly restored to power in France.
This is right after Napoleon, right?
Exactly, after the final definitive defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo the year before. So you have King Louis XVIII on the throne. But we really have to understand the factions at play here to understand the disaster.
It wasn't exactly a unified country.
Not at all. You basically have two completely different worlds forced to share the same country and the same military.
Right. I'd imagine the transition wasn't smooth. It's not like Napoleon leaves and everyone just instantly agrees to wear royalist colors and sing the king's praises.
Far from it. On one side, you have the Bonapartists. These are the hardened military veterans, the career officers who spent the last 20 years fighting intense, grueling campaigns across Europe and on the seas.
The guys who actually know what they're doing.
Right. They earned their ranks through blood and merit under the empire. Now, on the other side, you have the returning royalists, the émigrés.
Ah, the aristocrats.
Yes, the aristocrats who fled the French Revolution decades ago. They spent the last 20 years living comfortably in exile, mostly in England, basically just waiting for the political winds to change.
So they come back expecting everything to go back to normal.
Exactly. Now that the monarchy is back, these aristocrats are returning to France, and they expect their old privileges, estates, and military commands to be handed right back to them.
It's like the ultimate new boss scenario, but with incredibly high stakes. The king is back, and he's basically handing out favors and top-tier jobs to all the aristocrats who stayed loyal to him during the exile.
Regardless of what they've actually been doing for the last 2 decades.
Yeah, merit has nothing to do with it.
And that's where the rot at the top really sets in. The priority of the restored Bourbon state wasn't administrative efficiency or military readiness. The priority was consolidating power and rewarding loyalty to the crown.
Which means getting rid of the competent people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To do that, they started purging the experienced Bonapartist officers from the military and replacing them with loyalist aristocrats.
And one of those rewards was a ship.
Yes.
Huh.
A high-profile reward was the command of a French frigate called the Méduse, which was being sent on a diplomatic and colonial mission down to Senegal to reclaim territory from the British.
And who do they pick for this flagship?
The man they chose to command it was Viscount Hughes du Roi de Chaumareix.
Viscount Hughes du Roi de Chaumareix. I mean, just the name alone sounds like it belongs in a Versailles ballroom, not on the splintered deck of a warship.
And while his resume perfectly matched that assumption, Chaumareix was an aristocrat in his mid-50s. Technically, yes, he had naval experience. Technically, he had served in the Navy before the Revolution, but he had not commanded a ship at sea in roughly 20 years.
20 years.
A full 2 decades had passed since he had meaningfully navigated a vessel or commanded a crew in open waters.
20 years. I want you listening right now to just pause and think about the sheer arrogance of that. It's like a major commercial airline handing the keys of a modern, massive jumbo jet filled with hundreds of passengers to a guy whose only experience is flying a tiny crop duster in the early 2000s.
And doing it simply because he's drinking buddies with the airline's CEO.
Right. The navigation technology has completely changed. The maritime protocols are different. His instincts are completely rusted over, but he gets the captain's chair anyway.
The disaster is baked into the ship's DNA before they even untie the ropes at the dock.
It really is. It's completely inevitable.
And what makes it worse is the dynamic on the ship itself. You have to imagine the palpable tension on the deck of the Méduse.
Because his crew knows, right?
They know instantly. Chaumareix is surrounded by junior officers who actually know what they're doing, men who have been sailing and fighting for years. They see right away that the man at the helm is dangerously out of practice.
And I'm guessing he doesn't want to hear it from them.
Not at all. He refuses to listen to them because he views them as socially and politically inferior.
So you have a captain who doesn't know what he's doing, ignoring the people who do, out of pure class snobbery. The anxiety on that ship must have been suffocating.
It was a disaster waiting to happen. So they set sail for Senegal in June of 1816. The Méduse is part of a small convoy traveling with 3 other ships.
And we get to July 2nd. They're off the coast of present-day Mauritania in West Africa. Walk us through the anatomy of the grounding. How does a supposedly state-of-the-art frigate just crash into a sandbank?
It's a masterclass in hubris. The Méduse is a fast ship, significantly faster than the rest of the convoy. Chaumareix, seemingly eager to show off, or perhaps just impatient with the slower vessels, decides to break formation and race his ship ahead.
Which is already breaking the rules of traveling in a convoy.
Right. Now, the waters off the coast of Mauritania are notorious among sailors. Everyone knew about a massive, shifting underwater hazard called the sandbank.
Like a famous hazard.
Very famous. It's a vast expanse of incredibly shallow water, reefs, and sandbars that stretches far out into the ocean. Standard naval protocol dictated giving that area a massively wide berth.
So he's essentially speeding through an underwater minefield without a map. He leaves his safety net behind just to look good.
And he actively ignores the warnings. His experienced junior officers are looking at the color of the water changing, which is a clear sign of shallowing depths.
You can physically see the danger.
Yes, they are taking soundings, throwing lead lines over the side to measure the depth, and the numbers are dropping rapidly. They are pleading with Chaumaris to change course.
And what does he do?
Instead, Chaumaris places his trust in a passenger, a civilian, a guy who was part of the colonial expedition who merely claimed to know the waters. He chooses to listen to a sycophant over his own trained crew.
Unbelievable.
The result is inevitable. On the afternoon of July 2nd, the Méduse runs hard aground.
Just a sudden, catastrophic crunch of timber. The ship pitches forward, the masts shake, and they are completely stuck.
Stuck deeply. It wasn't a grazing blow. The ship was driven forcefully onto the sandbank during high tide. When the tide went out, the hull was resting on the sand and the structural integrity of the ship began to fail.
Because ships aren't meant to sit out of the water like that. The weight crushes them.
Exactly. Over the next few days, the crew makes desperate attempts to free her. They throw heavy cannons and supplies overboard to lighten the load. They try to use the ship's anchors to winch themselves off the bank.
But nature always wins.
It does. A storm rolls in, the massive waves batter the trapped ship, and the hull officially breaches. The Méduse is irreparably broken.
The ship goes from being a vessel to just a broken building sitting in the ocean. And suddenly, this arrogant, aristocratic captain has a brand new problem.
The focus shifts entirely.
It's no longer a navigation issue. Now, it's a terrifying mathematical problem. Let's look at the numbers, because this arithmetic dictates every piece of horror that follows.
The math is brutal. There are roughly 240 people aboard the Méduse.
240.
Yes. This passenger list includes Captain Chaumaris, the newly appointed governor of Senegal, senior officers, a contingent of scientists and engineers, an army battalion of common soldiers, and the regular sailing crew. 240 souls.
And I'm guessing, based on the era, there are no inflatable life rafts packed into the ceiling. What is the actual lifeboat capacity?
There are only 6 small boats aboard the frigate. Combined, they can safely carry roughly 250 people if the sea is perfectly calm.
Which it wasn't.
No. In rough water and fully loaded with provisions, their capacity is significantly less. Crucially, they realize very quickly that there isn't nearly enough space for all 240 people to comfortably and safely abandon ship.
It's a systemic failure of safety regulations that we'll see echoed a century later on the Titanic.
Precisely. They just didn't plan for the worst-case scenario.
So you have 240 panicking people, a dying ship groaning under the waves, and a severe deficit of lifeboat space. What is the official plan?
Well, the crew comes up with an engineering solution. They decide to construct a massive raft using the ship's own timbers to carry the overflow of passengers.
Okay, so they're dismantling the ship to build a raft.
Right. They dismantle the ship's topmasts, which are these huge, heavy beams of wood, and lash them together with rigging rope. They lay planks across it to create a deck. The final structure is roughly 20 meters long by 7 meters wide.
I know I've used this comparison before, but it really bears repeating for the visual. A standard tennis court is roughly 23 by 8 meters.
So it's basically a tennis court.
Exactly. This raft is basically the exact footprint of a single tennis court. It's just a flat, crude, splintered platform of tied-together logs floating next to the wreck.
And here is where the social hierarchy of 19th century France maps itself perfectly and fatally onto the survival situation.
Right. The million-dollar question. Who goes where?
Who gets the relatively safe, maneuverable lifeboats, and who gets the experimental pile of logs? The answer is exactly what you'd expect.
Let me guess. The rich get the boats.
Yes. The lifeboats are explicitly reserved for the privileged. Captain Chaumaris, the governor and his family, the senior officers, the wealthy passengers, they all board the lifeboats.
Of course. The very people whose arrogance and incompetence caused the wreck ensure they have the safest, driest seats away from it.
Meanwhile, the remaining people, the common infantry soldiers, the lower-ranked sailors, the engineers, the people whose names hold zero political weight, they are ordered onto the raft.
How many people exactly?
Around 147 people are forced to crowd onto this 20 by 7 meter wooden platform.
Let's talk about the physical reality of that.
Yeah.
Imagine standing on a tennis court with 146 other people. You are packed shoulder to shoulder.
You literally can't move.
There is no room to pace. There's barely room to sit down without sitting on someone's legs. And more importantly, let's talk about the physics. Wood floats, sure, but 147 adult human beings weigh roughly 22,000 pounds.
That's a massive amount of concentrated weight.
What happens when you drop 22,000 pounds onto a hastily tied bundle of heavy masts?
The buoyancy fails instantly. The sheer concentrated weight of 147 people immediately pushes the raft below the surface of the water.
So they're not even on a dry surface.
No, from the very first second they step onto it, the passengers are standing in knee-deep ocean water. The wood is waterlogged, the ropes are stretching.
This sounds like a nightmare before they even detach from the ship. So what's the plan to get this sunken tennis court to land?
The official plan, the promise shouted down from the safety of the dry lifeboats, is that the lifeboats will tie thick tow ropes to the raft and row in a line, towing the raft safely toward the distant African coast.
Okay, so the people on the raft are scared, they're freezing in the water, but they're looking ahead at the captain's boat. They're thinking, this is miserable, but we're tethered to the command structure. They're pulling us to shore.
That was the idea, yes.
And then the betrayal happens. The tow lines are cut.
Yes, they sever the ropes.
I really want to challenge the mechanics of this moment. Was this a panicked heat of the moment thing? Like the fluid dynamics of dragging a submerged 22,000-pound tennis court were literally pulling the lifeboats backward under the waves and some sailor panicked and hacked the rope with an axe? Or was this a cold, calculated act of murder by the aristocratic class?
The historical record, specifically the later testimonies of those on the lifeboats, suggests a chilling mixture of cowardice and calculation.
So it wasn't just a sudden snap decision.
No. It's true that the physics of the situation were daunting. A submerged, unstreamlined mass of wood creates incredible drag. The lifeboats were making agonizingly slow progress, maybe a fraction of a knot.
Barely moving at all.
Right. The men rowing were exhausted and a slight wind was pushing them back. But the decision to cut the ropes wasn't a split-second reaction to a sudden wave. It was a conscious choice made by leadership.
But you've talked about it.
They looked at the creeping pace, they calculated the minor increase in their own risk if the weather turned, and they prioritized their absolute, immediate safety over the guaranteed death of 147 men.
They didn't just abandon them, they actively severed the lifeline. It's a stunning realization.
It's the ultimate failure of leadership.
A captain appointed entirely through political nepotism feels zero actual moral duty to the men beneath him. The ropes drop into the water, the privileged take up their oars, and the splash of those oars just gets quieter and quieter until the lifeboats are just tiny specks on the horizon, and then they're gone.
Leaving 147 people adrift on a submerged platform in the open Atlantic.
Without any supplies, right?
Barely any. They have virtually no navigational tools. In the chaos of boarding, they drop their primary water casks into the ocean.
So no fresh water.
They are left with a tiny amount of hardtack biscuit, which gets soaked in seawater almost immediately, and a few small casks of wine. They have absolutely no shelter from the blistering African sun or the freezing night winds.
This is where the maritime disaster ends, and a 13-day descent into absolute madness begins.
Yes, the true horror starts here.
Walk us through that timeline, because 13 days doesn't sound that long when you're on vacation, but when you're standing in the ocean, it's an eternity. They watch the lifeboats disappear, the sun goes down on that first day, the ocean gets dark. What happens mechanically to that group of people?
The sheer attrition begins immediately. Night one is effectively a slaughter.
Just on the first night?
Yes. The raft, as we established, is floating below the surface. There are no guardrails, no walls. When the nighttime weather turns and the ocean swells, the waves don't just rock the raft, they sweep aggressively right over the top of it.
Oh, God.
You have 147 people crammed together in pitch blackness, slipping on slimy, wet wood. The raft itself is flexing, the heavy mass grinding against each other.
It's just a meat grinder.
Dozens of people are simply swept off the edges into the dark water and drown instantly. Others get their legs trapped in the shifting gaps between the timbers and are crushed. By the time the sun rises on the second morning, 20 men are already dead or missing.
And the psychological shock that sunrise, you wake up exhausted, freezing, and you look around, and the guy who's pressed against your shoulder all night is just gone.
And that's when the reality truly sets in. The lifeboats aren't coming back. You are entirely alone.
That realization, combined with the rapid onset of severe physiological stress, breeds a very specific kind of madness.
By day 2 and 3, the effects of dehydration become catastrophic. The human body loses water incredibly fast in the open sun. And what happens when a human being is surrounded by water they cannot drink, but their brain is screaming for hydration?
They drink it.
Men break down. Driven insane by thirst, they start cupping their hands and drinking the seawater.
Which is the absolute worst thing you can do. The mechanics of drinking seawater are terrifying. Your kidneys can only produce urine that is less salty than seawater.
So it's a net loss.
Exactly.
Huh.
So to get rid of the excess salt you just drank, your body actually has to expel more water than you consumed. You literally dehydrate yourself faster by drinking it.
It induces severe hypernatremia. The excess sodium draws water out of the brain cells, causing them to shrink. This leads to profound neurological collapse. We're talking severe hallucinations, delirium, and violent psychosis.
It completely breaks their minds.
Henri Savigny, the surgeon on board who survived, later wrote about the men experiencing beautiful, tragic hallucinations of lush green fields and rivers in France right before they threw themselves into the ocean.
The social contract completely evaporates. There is no rank, no military discipline. It devolves into a caged animal scenario.
Mutinies break out, and they are astonishingly violent. It wasn't just blind flailing factions formed. The soldiers, feeling betrayed by the sailors, turned on them.
They're fighting each other on a sinking raft.
Yes. Men fought to the death over a safe spot in the center of the raft, furthest away from the deadly edges. They fought over the tiny remaining rations of wine. They fashioned makeshift weapons out of the raft's metal fittings and started murdering each other in the middle of the Atlantic.
That's insane.
During one particularly horrific night of rioting, over 60 men were killed or thrown overboard.
I want to keep grounding this for the listener.
Yeah.
Put yourself on that raft. You haven't slept in days. The salt water is eating away the skin on your legs. You are hallucinating. Your fellow crewmates are hunting each other with pieces of metal. Every single rule of civilized society you've ever known has completely dissolved.
And you're still only halfway through the ordeal.
That's the craziest part. By day 8, the population of the raft has plummeted from 147 to just 27 people. And this forces the remaining survivors into a brutal, chilling calculus.
They take stock of their situation. They look around at the 15 badly wounded, delirious men among them, men who had been slashed in the mutinies or crushed by the wood. Savigny, the surgeon, does the grim medical math.
Which is just, it's horrifying.
These wounded men are consuming space, they are consuming the last drops of wine, and clinically speaking, without a hospital, they are mathematically guaranteed to die anyway.
Oh man, I know where this is going, and it's the darkest logic imaginable.
It is the arithmetic of abandonment repeating itself just on a microscopic, intimate scale. First, the privileged in the lifeboats abandon the raft to save themselves. Now, the strong on the raft decide they must abandon the weak.
They execute their own people.
The remaining able-bodied survivors make a pact. They physically pick up their wounded, sick, and dying crewmates, and they throw them alive into the sea. They execute their own comrades to stretch the remaining wine for a few more days.
The privilege of health and strength is weaponized. And the terrifying part is, under the extreme duress of starvation, you can follow their twisted logic.
It makes complete sense to a starving brain.
Right. It's an act of collective self-preservation that destroys whatever humanity they had left. But even that sacrifice doesn't solve the core problem. They have zero food.
Which brings us to the final taboo. The starving survivors, whose bodies are literally consuming their own muscle and organ tissue to stay alive, resort to cannibalism.
Oh, man.
They begin butchering the dead bodies of the crewmates that are tangled in the ropes. They cut strips of human flesh and drape them over the rigging to dry in the sun, trying to make it more palatable.
They are drying human jerky on the ropes.
Yes. They cross a line from which there is no psychological return.
13 days of this. Drowning, madness, organized murder, execution, and cannibalism. It is a literal descent into hell. And then on July 17th, something breaks the horizon. A ship.
The remaining men summon the last ounces of their strength. They hoist a man onto an empty barrel, waving a scrap of cloth. The ship is a French brig called the Argus. But the arrival of the Argus highlights a deeply tragic irony.
Wait, let me guess. The Argus wasn't dispatched by Captain Chamariz to save them? The captain didn't get to shore and immediately say, "Send the fleet, my men are dying."
Not at all. The Argus wasn't looking for survivors.
Are you kidding me?
The government officials and the captain who had safely reached the shore in the lifeboats hadn't organized a rescue mission for the raft. The Argus was sent out strictly on a salvage mission to the original wreck of the Méduse.
To get their stuff back.
To see if they could recover the barrels of gold coins and vital colonial supplies that had been left behind. They weren't looking for human beings, they were looking for cargo. They stumbled upon the raft entirely by pure, blind chance.
It's just staggering. When the crew of the Argus finally pulls alongside the raft, what do they find?
The accounts from the Argus sailors describe a scene of absolute paralyzing horror. The smell of decay, the blood-stained wood, the strips of human flesh hanging from the ropes. And out of the roughly 147 people who had been forced onto the raft, only 15 men were left alive.
15. From 147 down to 15 in less than 2 weeks.
And of those 15, they were so starved, so physically broken and deeply traumatized, that 5 of them died shortly after being pulled from the water and brought to the hospital in Senegal.
So 10 actual survivors in the end.
Exactly. Across the entire disaster, including those who died on the initial wreck, those who perished trekking across the desert after the lifeboats landed, and the massacre on the raft, roughly 390 people lost their lives due to the incompetence of one politically appointed captain.
The survivors are eventually brought back to civilization. They are fed, they are clothed. But for the French government, the restored Bourbon monarchy, the absolute nightmare is just beginning.
Because the story gets out.
Right. The political liability isn't the death toll. The state doesn't care about 100 dead infantrymen. The political liability is that Henri Sévigny and Alexandre Corriard, 2 of the survivors, are still breathing, and they kept their minds intact enough to take notes.
That is the pivotal shift in the story. We transition from a physical survival story to an information war. Sévigny was the ship's surgeon. Corriard was an engineer and geographer.
Which is key. They aren't just deckhands who might be dismissed as confused or prone to exaggeration. They are men of science. They understand empirical observation. They understand cause and effect.
Exactly. When they recover, they decide they cannot stay quiet. They systematically document everything. They write down the staggering incompetence of Captain Chamariz on the sandbank. They meticulously detail the moment the lifeboats cut the tow ropes. They record the mutiny, the starvation, the cannibalism.
They lay it all out.
But most dangerously for the Bourbon regime, they connect the dots. They explicitly link the blood on the raft directly to the political cronyism of the king's court. They argue that if the government hadn't prioritized aristocratic loyalty over maritime competence, the Méduse would never have sunk.
They write the ultimate receipt. And what happens to this document? Because in 1817, you can't just tweet it out.
First, Sévigny writes a formal report intended for the Ministry of the Marine. But the document leaks to the anti-royalist press.
Oh, of course it does.
The journalistic machinery of Paris, which was highly factionalized, catches hold of it. Seeing the public reaction, Sévigny and Corriard go a step further. In 1817, they published their full, uncensored account as a commercial book.
And we have to understand the mechanics of media virality in the 19th century. A book like this didn't just sell copies. It was read aloud in coffee houses. It was serialized in pamphlets. It was translated. It becomes an absolute sensation across Europe.
A viral hit before the internet.
I can only imagine the sheer panic in the halls of power. The monarchy is reading this book, seeing it fly off the shelves, and realizing the public is getting a front row seat to their deadly incompetence.
Historically speaking, the regime reacted the way almost any fragile political establishment reacts to an existential scandal, aggressively and defensively.
They go into damage control.
They initiated a massive cover-up campaign. The state tries to suppress the story, they heavily censor the pro-government newspapers, and they attempt to discredit Sévigny and Corriard as bitter, insubordinate radicals.
And they use their bureaucratic power to punish them. Corriard, the engineer, held a government contract. What does the state do?
They fire him. The regime terminates his employment and cuts off his pension, explicitly trying to financially ruin him and silence him, sending a message about what happens to whistleblowers.
But Corriard's response is one of my favorite details in this entire history. The government fires him, assuming he'll just slink away into poverty and shame. Instead, Corriard leans in.
He embraces the scandal.
He does. He opened a bookstore right in the bustling center of Paris. And he doesn't give some quaint name. He names the bookshop at the wreck of the Méduse.
It's an act of supreme, calculated defiance. He uses the state's attempt to erase the event as the branding for his business.
It's brilliant. He stands right in the open at a shop named after the state's greatest shame and openly sells the exact book the government is trying to suppress. He builds a monument out of his own cancellation.
It completely exposes the limits of the state's power to suppress print media in an increasingly literate society. However, the state still controls the judicial system. The public anger reaches a boiling point where the government is forced to act. They have to put Captain Chamarace on trial.
Right, the guy who crashed the ship, abandoned his crew, and caused the deaths of nearly 400 people. How does the military court handle him?
The trial is a masterclass in institutional whitewashing. Chamarace faces a court-martial, but the judges are his peers, fellow royalist naval officers who share his background and political allegiances.
So they're protecting their own.
They want to protect the institution. So, for a disaster of unprecedented scale, for cowardice in the face of the enemy being the ocean Captain Chamarace, is sentenced to a mere 3 years in prison.
3 years. You could get a harsher sentence for stealing bread in 19th century France. That is not justice. That's the establishment protecting its own.
The public recognized the sham immediately, but from the regime's perspective, the paperwork was filed. They held a trial, issued a sentence, and officially closed the book on the Méduse.
They thought it was over.
They assumed the news cycle would move on. Print fades, after all. Books go out of print. The government genuinely believed the Raft was on the verge of becoming a mere historical footnote, buried under the next week's political drama.
And if history had played out normally, they would have been right. The men who died were mostly poor, working-class soldiers. Their names didn't matter to anyone in power. They would have been forgotten. But the state didn't account for a 27-year-old kid who decided he wasn't going to let the story sink. Enter Theodore Jericho.
This is where the narrative shifts from a naval cover-up to one of the most intense, obsessive artistic pursuits in human history. Theodore Jericho is a young painter living in Paris.
He's not just some struggling artist, though.
No, he's ambitious, he's independently wealthy, so he doesn't rely on state commissions, and he is deeply disillusioned by the political climate. He reads Savigny and Corraird's book, and it utterly possesses him.
He doesn't just read it and think, oh, that's a sad story, maybe I'll paint a boat. He treats the canvas like a detective's corkboard. Explain how radical his process was, because he essentially invents investigative journalism via paintbrush.
To understand how radical Jericho was, you have to understand the art world of 1818. The dominant style was neoclassicism. Think of Jacques-Louis David. Paintings were supposed to depict noble, stoic heroes from Greek mythology or idealized historical moments. Everything was clean, balanced, and morally uplifting.
And Jericho's about to paint dead bodies.
Exactly. Jericho throws all of those classical rules out the window. He decides to paint a contemporary news event, and he approaches it like a forensic investigator.
What are the mechanics of that investigation? How does he gather his evidence?
First, he bypasses the rumors and goes straight to the primary sources. He tracks down Henri Savigny and Alexandre Corraird. He interviews them extensively.
He actually talks to them.
He sits with them, forcing them to recall the exact details of the raft, the way the timber shifted, the specific color of the bruised skin, the desperation in the men's eyes.
He's taking witness testimony. But testimony isn't enough for him. He needs to understand the physical space.
Exactly. He tracks down the actual carpenter from the Méduse, a man who survived the raft. Jericho hires him to build a precise, mathematically accurate scale model of the raft right in the middle of his Parisian art studio.
He puts a giant raft in his studio.
He does. And then he creates wax figures and poses them on this model, studying how the mass of bodies would affect the buoyancy, and studying how the light from his studio windows cast shadows across the tangled limbs.
He's rebuilding the crime scene. But all of that, the interviews, the model, that's just the prelude. The next step in his process is the stuff of actual nightmares. If you are listening to this and you're squeamish, brace yourself. Because Jericho realizes that if he's going to paint 130 dead men, he can't just guess what death looks like. So he goes to the morgue.
He becomes intimately, obsessively familiar with human decay. The accounts of Jericho's studio during this period are deeply macabre. He spent weeks at the Beaujon Hospital, studying the faces of the dying. But worse, he reportedly bribed hospital workers to let him smuggle severed human limbs and severed heads back to his private studio.
Wait, let me stop you there. He's carrying severed body parts through the streets of Paris to his apartment.
Yes, he placed these severed limbs on his tables and meticulously painted them as they decayed over days and weeks.
That is deeply disturbing.
He needed to study the exact pallor of rotting flesh, the way blood pools in a deceased limb liver mortis, the specific tension of the muscles. The smell in his studio was reportedly so horrific that his friends couldn't bear to visit him.
No kidding.
He even shaved his own head, essentially locking himself into a self-imposed monastic isolation so he wouldn't be tempted to go out to parties. He lived with the dead for months.
I have to push back heavily here. We are talking about a 27-year-old artist surrounded by rotting arms and heads in a locked, putrid room. Was this actually artistic genius, or was this a severe psychological break? Where's the line between trauma voyeurism, just morbidly reveling in the gore of a tragedy, and genuinely honoring the dead? Because keeping severed heads on your dining table feels like it crosses a massive ethical and psychological line.
It's a debate that art historians still have today, and even his contemporaries thought he was losing his mind. But if we analyze the strategic context of what he was trying to achieve, the forensic obsession makes sense.
Also,
We have to remember the era. This is 1818. There is no photojournalism. There is no video footage of a disaster to broadcast on the evening news to make the public feel the reality of an event. The government was relying entirely on the abstract nature of statistics. 130 men died at sea is just a number on a piece of paper. It's easy for the public to ignore.
right, it's clean. The government wants it to be an abstract bureaucratic error.
Exactly. Jericho understood that to break through that political whitewash, his depiction had to be clinically, obsessively undeniable. If he painted idealized, muscular Greek heroes pretending to be starving, the royalist critics would just dismiss it as a fantasy.
They'd say that's not what it looked like.
Right. He wasn't creating a horror painting for shock value. He was drafting a visual indictment. The morgue studies were the only mechanical way to prove to the audience this is exactly what the state's incompetence looks like when the skin starts to rot. The realism was the weapon.
That makes incredible sense. He had to make it so hyper-real that no politician could look at it and say, oh, the artist is exaggerating. So he has his evidence, he has his morgue studies, now he has to physically paint the thing.
And it takes a massive toll on him.
The mechanics of painting a 16 by 23-foot canvas are insane. He's climbing up and down scaffolding for 8 months, working with tiny brushes to get the details of the faces right. And when he's finally finished, he plans his ambush.
This is the strategic brilliance of Jericho's protest. He doesn't unveil this masterpiece in a private gallery surrounded by liberal friends who already agree with him. He takes aim at the very heart of the Bourbon establishment.
By submitting it to the Salon.
Yes, the year is 1819, and the Paris Salon is about to open.
I want to frame this for the listener. The Paris Salon isn't just a museum exhibit. I imagine trying to sneak a subversive anti-government painting into the Salon is like trying to unroll a protest banner inside the king's own living room during a nationally televised event. The Salon was the ultimate state-run PR machine, right?
It was the premier cultural and political event of the year in France. Crucially, the Salon was held physically inside the Louvre, which was a royal palace. The exhibition was funded by the king, overseen by the king's ministers, and judged by a highly conservative jury of establishment academics.
So it was completely controlled.
Entirely. It was designed to showcase the glory and stability of the regime.
So Jericho decides he's going to smuggle this massive, rotting accusation right through the front door of the palace. How on earth does he get it past the conservative judges?
He uses a bureaucratic Trojan horse. When he submits the massive canvas to the jury, he doesn't call it the Raft of the Méduse.
Because they reject it instantly.
Of course. He submits it under an incredibly neutral, boring, generic title. He simply calls it Scene of Shipwreck.
Scene of Shipwreck. It sounds like a pleasant little watercolor of a fishing boat bumping into a dock. The judges look at the paperwork, they see the generic title. They probably don't bother to unroll a 23-foot canvas to inspect it closely, and they stamp it. Approved.
And then comes opening day, the unveiling.
Imagine being a wealthy aristocrat walking into the Salon of 1819. You are dressed in your finest clothes. You are expecting to see portraits of generals, scenes of Apollo, beautiful rolling landscapes. You turn a corner in the Louvre, and suddenly you are confronted by a wall of death.
It must have felt like a physical blow.
The canvas is so huge, the figures are life-size. They are right in your face. The rotting flesh, the despair, the father holding the corpse of his son, the chaotic tangle of limbs. Everyone in that room immediately knew exactly what this generic scene of shipwreck actually was.
The trap was sprung flawlessly, and the brilliance of the ambush is purely geographic. By hanging a massive depiction of the regime's most embarrassing, heavily censored scandal inside the king's own exhibition, guarded by the king's own royal guards, Jericho completely cornered the government.
Because they are paralyzed. They can't just throw a giant tarp over a 23-foot painting in the middle of opening day.
Exactly. The jury and the government officials realized what they had allowed in too late. If they ordered the royal guards to take it down, or if they tried to censor it after it had already been hung, they would be drawing massive international attention to it.
It would just confirm it.
It would be a tacit admission of guilt. The act of censorship would cause an even bigger political scandal than the painting itself. They were forced to leave it on the wall and let the public stare at the gruesome consequences of their own corruption.
It's the ultimate checkmate. He used the state's own museum to indict the state.
Mm.
What was the reaction in the room?
The reception was explosive, and it split straight down the political fault lines of the era. The royalists, the supporters of the Bourbon regime, were utterly revolted.
Natural.
But they couldn't attack the facts of the painting because it was too real. So they attacked its aesthetics. They called it a pile of corpses. They said it violated all the classical rules of beauty and good taste. They argued that art should elevate the soul, not drag it through the mud of a morgue.
Which is such a transparent defense mechanism. I don't like the political truth of this, so I'm going to complain about the brushstrokes. And how did the other side react?
The liberals, the critics of the monarchy, and the younger generation of artists recognized exactly what he had done. They called it courageous and revolutionary. They saw it as truth tearing through the veil of state propaganda. They recognized that Géricault was using the emotional intensity of the emerging romantic movement to force empathy for the victims of the state.
And when you look closely at the mechanics of the painting's composition, there is a deeper resonance to it. It's not just a chaotic pile of bodies. Géricault structured the painting very deliberately, specifically the figure at the very top.
Yes. Art historians point out the double pyramid composition. On the bottom left, you have a pyramid of despair, the dead and the dying, sliding into the water.
The ones who have given up.
Right. But as your eye moves to the right, the bodies rise up into a second pyramid of hope. And if you follow all the reaching arms, they lead up to the absolute apex of that second pyramid.
The guy waving the flag.
Yes. The man at the very top, the one waving the scrap of red and white cloth at the distant smudge of the Argus, is a thinker of color. He is a black man, believed to be modeled after an actual survivor of the Raft named Jean Charles.
And why is that specific choice so significant for a French audience in 1819?
Because France was in the midst of a fierce, ongoing debate over the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. The slave trade had been briefly abolished by Napoleon, but the Bourbon Restoration was ambiguous, and the colonial economy in places like Senegal was still entirely bound up in exploited labor.
So it's an intensely political statement.
Very much so. By placing a black man at the absolute pinnacle of survival, leading the desperate charge for salvation while white European men die helplessly below him, Géricault was making an incredibly powerful, implicit anti-slavery statement. He was elevating a marginalized figure to the status of the ultimate hero of the canvas.
He is hitting the establishment on every conceivable level. He's attacking their military incompetence, their callous class cruelty, and their colonial racism, all rolled into one giant, undeniable frame.
The painting eventually goes on tour to London, where it's viewed by tens of thousands of people. It becomes an international sensation, an icon of the Romantic movement, and it permanently cements the tragedy of the Méduse in the global consciousness.
So, as we pull all these threads together, what does this all mean? The captain of the Méduse was politically connected. The restored regime was deeply embarrassed and held all the legal levers of power to cover it up. The dead were mostly poor, unconnected soldiers and sailors whose names simply didn't matter to the aristocrats who ruled their world.
By every metric of how power operates, those 130-odd men who were hacked to pieces or drowned on that raft should have been completely forgotten. They should have been swept away by the current of time and state censorship.
But they weren't. Because one furious young artist, armed with obsessive research, a few severed limbs, and unparalleled talent, made them enormous. He made their suffering visceral, and most importantly, he made it permanent. 2 centuries later, look at where we are. The Bourbon regime is dust. King Louis XVIII is just a name you memorize for a history test. Captain Chaumaré is a pathetic historical footnote. But the Raft. The Raft hangs in the most visited museum on Earth. Millions of people stand exactly where Géricault wanted them to stand, bearing witness to the men the government tried to drown. The rescue Géricault delivered wasn't from the sea, it was from oblivion.
He proved that while the powerful can dictate the official records, they do not ultimately control human memory. Art can serve as a permanent physical anchor against the erasure of truth.
It is a stunning, undeniable victory of paint over politics. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us with a provocative final thought, something for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've seen how a massive painting from 1819 became a timeless emblem of abandonment. It's a symbol that is still invoked today. When you read news articles about modern migrant shipwrecks in the Mediterranean or refugees abandoned at sea, journalists still reference the Raft of the Méduse. It raises a haunting question. In our modern era, with our 24-hour news cycles, our endless social media feeds, and our constant digital information overload, what covered-up tragedies are happening right now? Who are the unpainted victims adrift on today's bureaucratic rafts, quietly abandoned by the privileged class while the lifeboats row away? And most importantly, who is waiting out there? Which furious young artist or whistleblower is preparing to force the world to finally look at them?
It's a historical cycle that continues to repeat itself, and it's exactly why looking back at that dark, towering canvas in the Louvre remains so vitally important.
The next time you're walking through a museum, don't just look at the marble and the gold. Look for the truth bolted to the wall. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and we'll catch you next time.